varied translates as checkered, I think, in terms of a career. So, I want to speak mostly from that checkered amalgam rather than from my current position at the Department of Energy, where I've only been since, well, I just finished my first 100 days, and I'm happy to report that I accomplished everything I set out to do in my first 100 days because I very easily selected the things I knew I could do in the first 100 days, but I got it done, and I actually can't speak a whole lot about, the future directions for DOE, but I can speak a lot about the history of the things that I've been looking at. And many of you who know me know, and it's most of you in the room actually, know that for many years I've been associated with this concept of science public affairs and science public relations as being all about the management of the trust portfolio. Managing the trust portfolio between the scientist and a public or publics, between an institution and the public or publics that it's interested in, its stakeholder publics in particular, and between the scientific enterprise more broadly and public or publics that find themselves as stakeholders to that enterprise. And in that context, I want to talk about three sort of major issues that I see from the perspective of federal communication or government-led communication of science and technology as it currently exists in the landscape here in Washington. So the first point I would make is that the federal government plays, this probably doesn't need to be said quite so, but I'll say it anyway, it plays an incredibly important and critical role in enabling science communication in the United States. Now, it does this in a couple of different ways. One wonders what would happen if the federal government stopped doing that. We may find out if sequestration continues, but one would find out how that happens. At least we would find out from the direct funding part of that. So one of the ways we do that is through direct funding, as we've talked about already, the broader impacts activities. NASA has had a similar project going for many, many, many years that talks about, that sets aside 2 to 3% of its major science grants for education and public outreach. I look at both of those, and in addition to the issues that Matt raised earlier about the issue of possible pressure to hype one's basic research in particular, there are a lot of questions about whether there are really robust things that are being selected for in that process. I can say at NASA, we've never really looked very closely at whether the 2 to 3% set aside has done squat for public understanding of science and technology in America. I think I'll be able to say after the 10 years, another 10 years at NSF, whether that broader impacts has done squat for science and understanding in America. If that's your metric, then I wonder whether we're doing the right thing. If that's not your metric, then we need to figure out what those metrics are, and I don't think we have a very good understanding of them. But nevertheless, we do provide that direct funding of science and technology communications. We also provide the indirect funding, and that's by way of the salaries and the research that we provide, and the indirect costs that we provide that fund the public information offices at the various universities and other grantees we have there. But I think even more importantly now, there's an implied requirement, sort of this implied understanding that, you get money from us, you have this requirement to go out and talk about it. Now, why do you do that? That's going to be another question that comes up in the third. The second major issue that I want to talk about is sort of what has happened in the changing landscape of federal communications practice. Catherine did a great job, I think, of if a very dim view of what's happening at the federal level, and I have to say I agree almost entirely with the situation she has portrayed about how most major federal science agencies do in fact practice public affairs and public relations and public science communication. And I say that with some reservations because I think there are good reasons why some agencies believe they do that, or they believe they do that for some good reasons. I also believe that there are some very transparent bad reasons that some agencies do that, and I think there's a good question we have as to what we support in that practice. But the fact remains that the practice of science communication over the last 20 or 30 years has moved from a public information officer model, where you have a person at an institution who is responsible for making sure that the public knows what's going on and responds to media requests, to public inquiries, to everything else in a general, neutral, and even-handed tone, to a marketing and institutional advancement model. And I think that's at every single agency now to a greater or lesser degree. Partly this has resulted from a change in the federal communications workforce. When I entered that workforce 30 years ago, most of the senior science communicators at agencies were in fact career scientists or career officials at the university or at the institution. They are now overwhelmingly political campaigners who come in with a campaign mentality and a campaign approach to science communication. That has had some pretty significant effects on how we communicate in this space. Secondly, there's been a move to social media with the belief that you were tapping new and hitherto unrealized interest in the public about what's going on at your agency. That has yet to be proven. And lastly, I think that tracks a decline in legacy media, print media in particular, with the advent of media platforms. But lastly, I think the big issue is, what is the value add of communications, or the perceived value add of communications to an agency that is a research performing agency, and why should it fund it? And that's a question I think that is being asked on the Hill now, and I think we'll hear more about that tomorrow. I think it's a question being asked at the universities, and I think Sonny can tell us if he's still here. I don't, yeah, he left. You know, extension's a great thing. Universities are bailing out of extension right and left because it's very expensive and they can't afford it. So if it's so great, why can't we find money for doing that? After the Iron Curtain, point B, after the Iron Curtain, we really felt a need in the community to justify science. That's a new change. Before the Iron Curtain fell, basically you write a blank check. And so I really want to sort of figure out now, what is the bright line between communications done as institutional advancement and public communication done for its civic responsibility values. And I think there's a great deal on both sides of that bright dividing line, and finding what that dividing line is critical to our experience today.
Thanks, Rick. Chad English directs Compass's work to build constructive dialogue between scientists and policy and management communities. He's also Compass. Something the typology I didn't show is an example of a boundary-spanning organization that brings special expertise to the interface between scientists and the public, which Chad can talk about.
Thank you, Matt.